Thanks for listening to this timely message from Jesus Center. Find us on social media and download our free app. Also visit our website, jesuscenter.com, to find out more information and sign up for our weekly emails. We look forward to meeting you at our Sunday services and hope this message blesses your life.
I wanted to begin a series today called Loaded Stories, going into the parables of Jesus. It's been a while since we've done some verse-by-verse teaching in the Bible. We've done more topical, and at the start of the year, I believe I just needed a strategic time of rest. And so we had a lot of guest speakers coming through. But for the next maybe 2 to 3 or maybe even 4 months, I want to take some time to go verse by verse into the parables of Jesus. And we want to call this series Loaded Stories. And today's message is titled Forgiven to Love. And it comes from Luke chapter 7, verse 36 to 50. So we'll go verse by verse. But let's start from verse 36. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. So we see now a Pharisee has invited Jesus. Now this is a little confusing because we know the Pharisees didn't like Jesus. Most of them wanted to kill Jesus. But this particular Pharisee, we'll later come to see that his name was Simon, he was very intrigued by Jesus. He heard so many positive things about him and so many negative things about him. There are some people who left everything to follow him. Then there are people who wanted him dead. And they were scheming every day and every night of how they can kill him. This kind of reminds me of how people love and hate a basketball player named LeBron James. He's the best basketball player in the world, if you don't know who he is. And he has just signed with the Los Angeles Lakers. And so, true Laker fans, we've been praying and fasting for this moment. But I've noticed that the bench players or the role players, people don't really pay attention to them. People don't think about them. You don't really love them or hate them. You just don't care about them. But when it comes to a superstar like LeBron James, it seems like, man, he draws the line in the sand. You're either for him or you're against him. But you know why it's so great that he joined the Lakers? Because the last 5 years, the Lakers have been the laughingstock of the NBA. And now the only man on planet Earth who can turn this team around has joined the team. And now there are these quote-unquote Laker fans who are ticked. And they're saying, this is always going to be Kobe's team. Why is LeBron James here? This is Kobe's team. And I'm thinking, Kobe retired. We need help. So they erected a mural with LeBron James just welcoming, they call him King James, it's a spin off the King James Bible, but they're welcoming the king to LA. And now people vandalized that mural saying, we don't want him. This is always going to be Kobe's city. This is Kobe's team. But if you're a Laker fan, I just want to preach gospel truth here. That you should be happy because he's here to help. And we were pretty pathetic without him. And that's how I feel about the haters of Jesus' day. Jesus is the talk of the town. He's no scrub. And the Jewish audiences were like, this is Moses' team. This is Abraham's team. We don't like this Jesus. But hey, those two men, they're great, but they retired. They're cool dudes, but they can't help you now, except maybe through their stories or the scriptures that the Lord released through them. But maybe you don't like Jesus, but he's here to help. And he's here to save humanity. How long have you been under Roman occupation? And so Jesus came to really make a difference and to heal humanity. So this Pharisee, he wanted to have dinner with Jesus to see what the fuss was about. He wanted to hear for himself, meet the man for himself and come to his own conclusions. And I respect that. But we know in hindsight from the teachings and interactions that Jesus had with the Pharisees that the Pharisees were the least God-like people on planet Earth. They were the furthest from God's heart and intent. And they were full of pride, and God opposes pride. And spiritual pride is also pride. And however, Jesus, he goes to this person's house, which was a big deal in that culture. That meant that he was open to having relationship with this person. So that tells us that Jesus, he engaged everyone. He engaged the religious and the pagans, the rich and the poor, the Jew and the Gentile, male and female. He rubbed shoulders with them all. And I believe that people who truly follow Jesus, we should be able to interact with all different kinds of people as well. Jesus was so versatile when it came to relating to people, and he attracted a very diverse audience. And by the way, we have a really diverse group here, a multi-ethnic, multi-generational community. It may be one of the most diverse communities in all the South Bay. So our potential here is so great. You know, we're not just catching bass, where we're catching like catfish, salmon, tuna, mahi, trout. I mean, just the potential of our reach is so great. Because there are some boats and they just specialize in tuna. But here, I mean, we have people from all different walks of life. And a good number of our people here, English is their second language. And I try to be sensitive to that. And that means that we have people in this room who grew up from all different parts of the world. Yet what we all have in common here is that we find Jesus incredibly fascinating and more than relevant to our lives. And I believe that when we as a community keep the message of Jesus at the forefront, not our particular preferences of church, we're charismatic, we're not conservative, or we're contemporary, we're not traditional, but instead of the preferences of church we have, let's keep the message of Jesus at the forefront. And as we keep the message of Jesus at the forefront, I believe that we'll be fascinating and relevant to people from all different walks of life as Jesus is. And Jesus, he often told loaded, multi-layered stories to communicate. And those stories we call parables. And these parables, they provoke thought. And the purpose of the parable was to accelerate transformation. So for the last 2,000 years, these are some of the most celebrated stories of all time. But his parables were confrontational. They were convicting. Jesus was not an entertainer. He came as a reformer. So these stories are like x-rays exposing the human condition and what was hurting the human race. And these stories were like signposts leading humanity to a better way of living, a better way of being. These stories were like windows into the heart and the mind of God. And Jesus would drop one of these stories on a Pharisee named Simon, who was acting like your typical snobby Pharisee. So Jesus, he asks him a question, then gets him thinking, then explains the meaning of the story. So Jesus didn't always explain the meaning to the parables. Sometimes he just told a parable and made them think about it. But in this particular parable, Jesus explains the meaning to the Pharisee. But Jesus, he just wanted to get in people's heads. I noticed that stories stick. I've been doing this for a while. I started preaching when I was 15 years old. And I recall that people, they don't really remember your profound, power-packed points. They don't come up to you and say, man, I loved every single one of those 4 points that you brought. I mean, they just blew my mind. And they recite the points to me. No, they say, oh, that was a really funny story, man. Oh, that was a really sad story. That really happened? And so people remember stories. Stories have a way of really sticking with us. And so Jesus, he believed that when you can get someone thinking about something long enough, it can seep down into their heart, and the heart is the control panel of our lives. And the ultimate goal that Jesus had with each of these stories was not just to entertain people, but was to see people's lives transformed. So let's go to Luke chapter 7, verse 37. So now there was a woman at that town who lived a sinful life and learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. Notice that she wasn't invited. She just came. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. This woman, she was not invited. She'd been following Jesus. This is stalker status right there. Somebody should have issued a restraining order. But here, how did she know Jesus was going to be at Simon's house? Maybe she was just following him from a distance, or some Bible scholars believe that Simon was a very wealthy man, and most people lived in these one-bedroom studios, but the wealthy, they had a courtyard, and they had many rooms to their house, so the courtyard was usually outside where they would host the guests, and they would all sit out in the courtyard, and maybe she saw through the gate that led into the courtyard, and she saw Jesus and wanted to get in there too, so she joined the party that she wasn't invited to. So do you ever wonder, why didn't they kick her out of the house? Why didn't they evict her from the dinner table? Shouldn't they call the cops on her? The reason why she was able to stay and her place was safe and secure was because Jesus, the main guest, made her his guest. I'll say that again, because Jesus, the main guest, made her his guest. Of course, the Pharisee didn't believe that she was good enough to dine with them. She was a woman, and so men rarely had dinner with women, but not just that, but she was a sinful woman. But since Jesus accepted her, she had a place in the house. Since Jesus accepted her, she had a place in the house. The Pharisees were very exclusive. They only wanted to share meals with those they felt were worthy of them, those who were cut from the same cloth, if you will. But Jesus was very inclusive. And I think that's a big reason why the sinful woman was following him around. That's why the children flocked to Jesus. That's why the half-breed Jews, the Samaritans, would converse with Jesus. That's why the Gentiles would even approach Jesus. Now Jesus, he was born into a fiercely dividing world. There was raging hostility among the different factions. It's like the Deep South 200 years ago, plus and that meeting South Africa 50 years ago. That was the world that Jesus was born into. And yet, if Jesus includes you, your place is safe and secure. If Jesus includes you, your place is safe and secure. Even if religious people exclude you, they don't have the final word. I don't think anybody in this room likes the feeling of being left out. But those that people leave out, God has a way of inviting in. And your acceptance in Jesus, by Jesus, is weightier than any kind of rejection we may have experienced from anyone else. Jesus came to display the heart of God, and God has a way of including those that others exclude. King David, a man after God's own heart, who understood this concept, he said in Psalm chapter 27, verse 10, that even though my father and mother abandoned me, the Lord will hold me close. The Lord will hold me close. I mean, it's one thing to be rejected by strangers. It's more painful to be rejected by friends. And it's excruciating to be rejected by family. And specifically the two people who conceived you and named you. It can be absolutely damaging, to say the least. How many hours of therapy does a person have to go through to be rejected by mother and father? But David declared that the more people reject you, the deeper the rejection is, the closer the Lord is willing to bring you in. And so we all fear rejection, yet rejection is an inevitable experience of life. But do you believe that the more people reject us, the closer the Lord will hold us and bring us to himself? And that's a comforting thought. I think it causes us to fear rejection less. And the less we fear rejection, the more freed we are to love. According to Apostle Paul's observation, God has a propensity towards the underdogs. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26 to 28, it'll be up on the screen. My dear children, remember that when God chose you, the people of this world didn't think that many of you were wise. So maybe you were rejected as being unintelligent, and God chose you. Let's keep reading. Only a few of you were in places of power. Not many of you came from important families. But God chose the foolish things of this world to put the wise to shame. And he chose the weak things of this world to put the powerful to shame. And what the world thinks is worthless, useless. By the way, people looked at that woman who positioned herself at the feet of Jesus. They saw her as worthless. They saw her as useless. They saw her as nothing at all. But it says that's what God has used to destroy what the world considers important. And that woman's story inspires us even today, because God is using her story. And so we see this as a running theme in the entire scriptures. God says to Israel, I chose you. You are my chosen people, not because you are the biggest and you are the brightest, but because you are the smallest. He says to Gideon, I chose you because you are the least of the least in Israel. I referred to David earlier. God says, I chose you because you're the least of your brothers. So those that we may count out, God may be saying, I want him. I want her So I think we need to be careful not to write people off. You don't have to be perfect for Jesus to include you. That is good news. That's what we see from this whole story, this narrative, that you don't have to be perfect for Jesus to include you. Well, what we see from this woman is that she is not perfection, but she has an appreciation in her heart. We know she doesn't have a perfect past, but she has a desire in the present to know God. And I think that nobody in this room has a perfect past. There's things that are probably in our lives that we've not told anybody about. However, if you have a desire in the present to know God, Jesus is willing to work with that. Now, this was very expensive ointment that this woman is about to release and pour on the feet of Jesus. I don't know the details about this woman, but we just know that she has a sinful past. She could have very well been a prostitute, and she may have made her money by selling herself. And that alabaster jar of perfume was her savings account. It was the most valuable thing that she owned. So I have a question for us this morning. Is there something that you wanted so bad that you began compromising your conscience for it? What is that thing that you just wanted so bad that you were willing to violate your conscience in efforts to attain it? Whatever that thing is, when you're able to release that thing to God, He's going to pour out His peace over your life, and you experience more of His freedom in your life. And what is that thing that you obsess over? You know, that alabaster perfume of oil, Bible scholars say that it was something she wore around her neck. It was her necklace, so it was something that was always on her heart. What is that thing that is always on your heart? When you're willing to release that and give it to the Lord, only then can He really release His peace and His freedom upon you. She got to a point in her life where she was willing to let go of the very thing she was living for previously. What are you living for? What do you obsess over? What do you want so badly that you'll go for it at all costs? When you can let go of that, then we qualify for the peace of God. I'm not saying that after church today you go ahead and sell everything you have and give everything away. But I believe that there are some things that we hold on to too tightly. We white knuckle it, if you will. And it's probably not a jar of perfume for you and for me, but it's something else that we want so badly that we sometimes compromise our values to keep it and to pursue it. And we hold on to it. We hold on to it. And it's always on our heart. It's an obsession. It's something that we want so bad. You hold on so tight. You know, when it comes to getting a handshake, you want a nice and firm handshake, but you don't want somebody to crush your bones to powder. Have you ever met somebody like that? It's like, please let go now, you know? Like, well, what are you, some like UFC fighter? Like, you know, let go. Because it's okay to hold something, but it's another thing to hold on to it way too tightly, where it's to an erroneous extreme. But when we can let go of what we obsess about, we qualify for more of God's peace. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, Peter says, cast all your cares. Not all your obligations, or not all the things that you care less about, but cast all your cares. So the things that you tend to obsess about, cast those upon the Lord, for He cares for you. We don't have to cast the stuff that we don't care about. So we're specifically instructed that what you care immensely about, that's what you need to keep releasing to the Lord. Not the things that we do out of obligation, but the things that we're obsessed over, that's what we need to continue to release to God. I have a confession. I do not obsess over vegetables. I drank it this morning because my wife made me this green smoothie, so that's the only reason I had some vegetables. But I don't obsess over vegetables. I'm not like thinking about carrots and the different vegetables all day long. But I obsess about how our church is doing. And so this is an area I need to continue to release to God. And that doesn't mean I be complacent or negligent with this church that God has entrusted to my leadership. Yet it means I don't let this church become my everything. And so it's church for me. What is it for you? And I believe that it's important to be people of desire and even people of passion, but not cross the line into obsession. Because obsession is when desire has gone out of control. Now there may be someone who will say and they'll ask, but you can't be successful without being obsessive. Are you suggesting that we live without dreams and passions and just be like this complacent, careless hippo, just floating down the river, not having a care in the world? I'm just saying that let's not let passion turn into obsession. I remember in my favorite movie up to a few weeks ago, it's Cool Runnings. Cool Runnings was my favorite movie since whenever it came out. I watched it in the theater. That was my favorite movie, but it's been since replaced by Crazy Rich Asians. But that was my favorite movie growing up, all the way until last month or 3 weeks ago, whenever my wife and I watched it. Man, I didn't cry when I watched Cool Runnings. I got the butterflies in my stomach, and I felt the warm sensation on my heart when I was a kid, and even when I watch it still, man, especially at the end when everyone starts standing up and clapping for them. But anyhow, but Crazy Rich Asians, I just started to cry. I was like, man, that is so cool. Like, we made it to the big screen, apart from martial arts. No, I was just thinking like, man, this is so, it was actually the storyline. Even if they weren't Asian, I would have still appreciated it. But it's funny, they captured a lot of the stereotypes of Asians. So I think if you're a non-Asian, it's hard for you to recap the movie without sounding racist. But for us Asians, we can talk about the movie and be like, we totally do that. That's my mom right there. That's my grandma. I totally get those dynamics. But at the movie, here I am crying, and then Meg is just watching, and here I am leaning on her shoulder. She's just watching. We walk out of the theater. She's like, I like Mission Impossible better. So she likes watching things blowing up and high action, and I guess I like the chick flicks. Anyway, see, now some of you, that's all you'll remember. It was a story. You remember it. That's all you remember. But anyway, well, what did Pastor Daniel talk about today? He talked about Cool Runnings, but his real favorite movie is now Crazy Rich Asians, and he cried, but Meg didn't. No, there's more to what we're going to talk about today than that. But in Cool Runnings, it's a story of the first Jamaican bobsled team, and the team captain, Darius, he's the driver. He wants to have a very personal conversation with the coach because he found out that the coach had his 2 medals confiscated or revoked because he cheated, and that was disclosed later on, and yet Darius didn't know that his gold medals were revoked. So Darius asked the coach, "Coach, why did you cheat?" And the coach now, he's now an old man. This is something he did decades ago, and he had many years to reflect. And so this was his response. He said, "I had to win, and I made winning my life." He says, when you make winning your life, you have to keep on winning, no matter what. And then he says, a gold medal is a wonderful thing, but if you're not enough without it, you'll never be enough with it. If you're not enough without it, you'll never be enough with it. So we should be pursuing our dreams, and I believe we need to have goals. I think even the automobile tells us that we can't be just looking backwards. We need to have things that we're looking forward to. The big windshield and the small rearview mirror. There's things that we need to be looking forward to and pursuing. And I believe it also takes diligent and faithful work, day in, day out, showing up when you don't even feel like it, to make the dream, the goals, and the plans come to pass. It takes resilience to make a dream come to pass. But even all that work shouldn't be from a place of panic, but from peace. All that work should be from a place of security, not anxiety. It must never feel like we're trying to prove ourselves, but we're just being ourselves. We have to be enough without it. That's what I'm saying, without the dream being fulfilled. Because if you're not enough without it, you'll never be enough with it. So a dream, it needs to be a passion, but when it becomes an obsession, it becomes a bondage. It provokes anxiety. It tethers us to anxiety. And so what do you have a tendency to obsess over? Whatever that thing is, we need to continue to make it a habit to release it to God. And after that woman was able to release that to Jesus, Jesus tells her at the end of this chapter, "Woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." Now we see that salvation is more than just a ticket to heaven. It speaks of freedom in this life as well. So Jesus is saying to her, because you're willing to let go, now you can experience more of God's salvation in your life, more of God's freedom in your life. And then Jesus commissioned her to live a life of peace. So we can experience more of God's peace. We can walk in more of God's peace in our life when we can let go of that thing that we hold on to too tightly. Now this woman, she must have had some previous encounter with Jesus. Somehow, somewhere, at some time, he did more than pique her interest. He touched her heart. And this is just her way of showing appreciation to this man. Now we don't know what kind of interaction Jesus had with her before, but we know that Jesus had a way of connecting with people and adding value to them. And so this is how the Pharisees made you feel. They made you feel like you were worthless because of your choices. But Jesus made you believe that you were better than the choices that you made. So the Pharisees, they made you believe that you were a totaled car. But Jesus made you believe that you were a Rolls Royce. And so when you got around the Pharisees, you began to see yourself as a totaled car. And you said, I have no more purpose for my life except the junkyard. But Jesus made you wonder, why do I keep putting bumper stickers on this Rolls Royce? Jesus had a way of adding value to people. When they experienced Jesus, they just got a taste of him. They got a taste of God's heart through a man who embodied God's heart. They wanted more. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Pharisees hated him, because Jesus was more popular than they were. I mean, go figure. Go figure. Maybe this explains why some churches are empty and other churches are full. Go figure. Even though she knew she wouldn't be celebrated in that home. She knew she'd be persecuted. She knew that people would be rolling their eyes or snarling at her. She knew her presence wasn't going to be celebrated. Yet she pushes through all the inconveniences to connect with someone who helped her to see her value. When you meet somebody who can see you as God sees you and gives you a taste of God's heart for you, to you, you'll be willing to push through a lot of inconveniences to be with that person, to be with that group, to be part of that church. I think about this next photo here. Instead of blaming the thousands of people who are not here, I think what we need to be asking is, how can I better display God's heart for people, to people? Instead of getting angry, hey, how come we don't see that? I think we need to stop and ask, this is the important question to ask, how can we better really capture God's heart and convey God's heart to human beings? Because I believe that if people can capture God's heart for them, they'll drive long distances, they'll push through a lot of obstacles to get here. I know of people that they don't come to Jesus Center because we don't have a 2:30 service. But I believe that people will push through a lot of obstacles to be here when they can really experience God's heart here. May we embody that. Luke chapter 7, verse 39, next verse. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. So this Pharisee believed that God shunned sinners. And so this Pharisee believed that if Jesus was from God, that Jesus would be rejecting her just like God rejects her. Now, what do you do when what Jesus presents is different from what you believe about God? What do you do? Do you now say Jesus is not of God? Or do you then refine what you believe about God? Because Jesus has a way, and this is why he's so fascinating, is that he had a way, he's so revolutionary, he had a way of going against what people's preconceived ideas about God were. And according to what we can gather here, this Pharisee named Simon, he believed that the more spiritual and godly you become, the less relatable you become to those who are less spiritual and godly. However, could the opposite be true? That really the more spiritual and godly we become, the more we become like Jesus, the more compassionate and welcoming we become to the other. It's not that we become less relatable, but like Jesus, we become more irresistible to those who are less spiritual and less godly. Let's go to the next verse here. Luke chapter 7, verse 40 to 42. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. I mean, Jesus, he's not holding back. Here's this rich guy. He's on top of the social ladder, and yet Jesus is going to call him out. No wonder they wanted to kill him. He says, Simon, I have something to tell you. And Simon says, tell me, teacher. He said, here's the parable. Here's the loaded story. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? You see here, I highlighted the words forgave and love. There is a relationship, there's a link between forgiveness and love. They're really two sides of the same coin. Next verse, verse 43, Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. Jesus was totally setting him up. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. And then Jesus explains the parable from verse 44. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house and you did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them away with her hair. Notice she let her hair down. You did not even give me a kiss, but from this woman, from the time I entered, she did not stop kissing my feet. You did not pour oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. This is what I read from commentaries. Hey, Meg, can you come up here and stand right there? So let's just say Meg is a rabbi. And when anyone, see, she's kind of dressed like the rabbi, right? Perfect. But whenever somebody would see a rabbi, this is my wife, by the way. But whenever somebody would, so I'm not just calling up the cute girl just to flirt, okay? That's what some pastors do, especially the single ones. You got to watch out for them. But this is what they did. In the presence of a rabbi, somebody would come and they would put their right hand on his left shoulder. They would put their left hand on his right shoulder. And then they would give him a kiss. And then they would go down and kiss his feet and even like wash his feet if they were inviting him to his house, because the feet were the primary method of transportation and they all wore sandals, so the feet were dirty, so they needed to wash the feet. But Simon didn't do any of that. Let's give Meg a hand. Simon didn't do any of that. He's acting like he is all that. He doesn't need to go low for anyone. But what he was not willing to do, this sinful woman did, and all the more. I believe that sometimes the most religious people can be the rudest as well. But I want to be around people who know how to treat others with honor and respect. His actions toward Jesus were rude, but his thoughts, and when we read about his thoughts, the thoughts he had towards the woman were just flat out mean. I like people who have a kind mind. Not just people who say kind things, but people who have a kind mind. Because what's in their mind begins to leak out and affect their attitude, and you can feel what they're thinking. And so I don't know if Jesus had a word of knowledge, or maybe he just looked at his face and saw him rolling his eyes, and whatever was in his mind was radiating from his face. I don't know how Jesus knew exactly what he was thinking. It could have been supernatural, or it could have been him just reading him. But this Pharisee is thinking a lot of judgmental things about this woman. Things that he would never say out loud. Maybe he wouldn't say out loud. He's thinking it at the moment. And it's leaking out of his attitude. When I read that, when I was studying that this week, I was thinking to myself, I don't want to entertain thoughts in my mind that I won't say out with my mind or with my mouth. Things I won't say publicly. I don't want to be thinking privately. And notice that Jesus rebukes him at his thought level. He didn't even say anything. But I believe that Jesus, he wants to correct us at our thinking level too. He wants us to monitor our thoughts. And if we want a better attitude, we need to audit our thoughts, because even though you don't say anything, we can smell your thoughts. And again, there are things that I would never say out loud, but I think it. Do you? And yet I believe Jesus is calling us higher. If those thoughts are not going to build anybody up, maybe we shouldn't even be thinking them. Luke chapter 7, verse 47. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. Remember, forgiveness and love, same package. Two sides of the same coin. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. And then Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. That is such good news. The other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Now he's telling her, you're saved. Go in peace. She had some big sins in her life, but she showed great love because she believed she was forgiven. Somebody described God's forgiveness as you receive it when you just put your glove up and open it up and receive, because He already threw the ball. So He already released forgiveness. Now we just have to believe and receive the forgiveness that He already extended. And I believe that because she believed she was forgiven, it made her into a more loving person. And Jesus speaks over her 3 words. You're forgiven, you're saved, and go in peace. You're forgiven, you're saved, and now go in peace. You know, when somebody greater than you speaks over you that you're forgiven, then He gives you permission for you to forgive yourself. I think what keeps us from being more loving people is that we don't know how to forgive ourselves. And so sometimes you need somebody in authority or somebody who's greater than you to tell you that you're forgiven, so that you can finally give yourself permission to forgive yourself. And that's what Jesus, a rabbi, a man of God, a true prophet of God, is doing for her. He's saying, I give you permission, woman, for you to forgive yourself, because your sins have been forgiven. And now He speaks over her, your faith has saved you. Now again, salvation is more than just a ticket to heaven. It's freedom on this earth as well. And when God really saves us, when we receive His salvation, He frees us up to love more. And then now He declares over her, you have peace. Because when we believe that our sins are forgiven, and we now release ourselves from even our own debts and our own guilt and our own shame, and we're freed up to love more people and love people more freely, then our lives will be marked by peace. These 3 words come together. Now the Pharisee, he doesn't think he needs forgiveness. But you can see that he's arrogant, rude, critical, mean-spirited. Imagine living with that Pharisee. Imagine if you're married to Simon. That is the death by 1,000 paper cuts. To live with a man who's that critical, that judgmental, that condescending, that mean-spirited, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. He needed forgiveness too. I'm sure whoever was part of his family, they were miserable with him. He needs to apologize to his family. But he doesn't even think he needs forgiveness. And he thinks he's better than Jesus. Like, I know God. This guy doesn't know God. I know God. And this woman, what a worthless woman. Is that how we think about others? Where we're always putting ourselves in a place of superiority over them, even in our thoughts. Again, things that you won't say, maybe we shouldn't think. You know, when she went down to wash the feet of Jesus with her hair, she let her hair down. And that was actually a very immodest thing to do. That's what the harlots did when they were at work. And people already think she's immoral, and now she's just proving their point. And she's letting her hair down, letting people know, this is who I am. In some ways, by letting her hair down, she's disclosing her past. And she can be real because she feels secure. I admire those who can disclose their past. I admire those who they don't have to act like they're perfect and they've always been perfect. I really respect those who can share stories about their own stupidity. I think I look up to those who can just be real about their mistakes. It just means that Jesus has set them free from shame, and they don't have to be a poser anymore. Jesus empowers people to be more real, not more fake. Because she believed that Jesus had accepted her, she could be real with him. Did you notice that you can be real with people when you know that they're going to accept you no matter what? But when you always question where you stand with them, you're always hiding everything. But when she got around Jesus, she felt a security that enabled her to be real. Because she believed this man from Galilee, he loved me at my worst. He added value to me when I was doing worthless things. So I don't need to be fake with him now or ever. She's able to share more about herself. And this is my favorite part of the whole message. She no longer cares what people think about her. She's letting her hair down. And yeah, this was me. And again, she's going to a party she was not even invited to. And she's just, outrageous. She's extremely excessive. She's extravagant in showing her affections for Jesus, to Jesus. And she doesn't give a rip what people think. She's a free woman. She's a free woman. I think we can really, truly be who God made us to be when we stop caring about what people think. I think what always keeps us from truly being able to be who God made us to be is we're preoccupied and we're paralyzed, we're petrified by what people think. She truly experienced salvation. That's why Jesus is speaking, your faith has saved you. You know, when the Jewish audience, in the first century, I'm not talking about in 2018, but in the first century, when they heard that word salvation, your faith has saved you. When they heard saved and salvation, they didn't think of Billy Graham. They thought about Egypt. Once upon a time, long, long time ago, our ancestors, we were slaves in Egypt. And they bullied us. They controlled us. We didn't have our freedoms. We just had to work as slaves for them. We were under their tyranny. We were under their control. We weren't free to dream. We weren't free to be. We were under Egyptian rule and domination. And then God came and set us free. I wonder if our Egyptians are people's opinions. Where that's what tyrannizes us. We're bullied by what other people think. We're tormented by what other people think. And our lives are so controlled by what other people think. And yet when we experience God's salvation, we get set free of what other people think. When we truly believe that we've been forgiven and that we're accepted, I have a place because Jesus made me his special guest. When we believe that our sins have been forgiven and we're now released to forgive ourselves and we live shame-free, then we can be set free from what other people think, and what other people think and say doesn't have to control us and torment us anymore. Here, this is my last point. I think when you hear this story, and even from this parable, we can then create a dichotomy and we can say that, okay, there's two classifications of people. There are the arrogant religious, and then there's people who are saved, free, and and they're the real people of God. Which side are you going to stand? Who are you going to be? You pick one, okay? I'm sure the guy sitting in the other side of the church, he's in the Pharisee section. I know him, but the person next to me, I think they're in the other section. And so it's so easy to put people into these classifications, into these categories. But I wonder if we can relate to both. I wonder if these are actually just the different stages of spiritual development. I wonder if we kind of all start off like that arrogant Pharisee named Simon. Have you ever been there where you found that, as you're spiritually still premature, you think you're super mature? That's the irony of it. The Pharisee thought he was off the charts, and she wasn't even on the graph. And yet he's spiritually premature. But have you ever been there in your spiritual premature state where you're judgmental, critical, condescending? You're always thinking of yourself superior to others. Have you ever been there in that state? And then you're so about your own name when you're at that level. Notice that Simon's name is mentioned. We don't know what that woman's name is. She's nameless. But could it be that when we're in the earlier stages of spiritual development, that we're still so about our own names and our own reputation and what people think about us? Who likes us and who doesn't like us? And yet could it be that as we spiritually develop, we become more like this woman who doesn't even have a name, where we become less about our own names, less ego, less selfish ambition, and where we can be like this woman and finally start letting go of things that we used to obsess over, and we can be more free to forgive ourselves and to love others and not give a rip about what people think. That's the irony of this whole story. The whole time, the Pharisee's thinking, I'm the spiritually mature one. And yet, really, he wasn't even on the map. And she was on an accelerated course. I think about when I was a young adult. I always thought I was better than everybody. I'm more spiritual than you. I have more revelation than you. I pray more than you. You're gaining some weight. You've not been fasting like me. And my thoughts were not always kind towards people. I did not always have a kind mind. And yet, as we mature, we realize I'm nothing without the grace of God. I'm nothing without the mercy of God. Who would I be? Where would I be? What would be of my life if God did not forgive me? And we become less about our own names because we've been forgiven to love. In conclusion, wherever you may be in your spiritual journey or in your spiritual development, I hope we're headed in the right direction. And it's profound that God would use a broken woman to inspire us. Let's stand.
Thanks for listening to this timely message from Jesus Center. Find us on social media and download our free app. Also visit our website, jesuscenter.com, to find out more information and sign up for our weekly emails. And hope this message blesses your life.